Good afternoon to you. 306 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we are making sense of the news. Coming up today at 3:30 from America First Legal, we'll talk to John Zadrozny as his organization discovers that the White House is saying that you have hundreds of emails between Hunter Biden and then Vice President Joe Biden, which are being protected from public disclosure because they're state secrets. Apparently. Why would Hunter Biden's business dealings be state secrets, would you say? Chris Bedford joins us today at 4:30 from the Common Sense Society magazine. We'll talk about all of our old senile politicians and what we're going to do about them. And then Stephen Nelson, the White House correspondent for the New York Post, is joining us today at 5 o'clock, one of the few who asks so many good questions when he gets the opportunity. And you can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. You may have heard in our news break just a moment ago that Donald Trump has pled not guilty today, obviously, in what Politico is referring to as the Georgia racketeering case, that he, quote, conspired to subvert the 2020 election in Georgia. Just as a reminder, he registered his objection to the way the election was conducted in Georgia. And he asked Georgia to fully audit every last vote and to ensure that they counted them properly. He was convinced that he had won the state of Georgia and even was on a recording to the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, making that argument. He said, we won. We're just 14,000 or whatever the number was, votes shy in the public record of declaring victory there. If you find those 14,000, that's us, baby. We win that state. So the guy made the call, and ever since then, the left has been trying to use that as a basis for claiming that he was trying to manufacture votes. Any fair hearing of that phone call proves otherwise. The phone call, as Alan Dershowitz says, is the most exculpatory piece of evidence in the whole case, and yet the left acts as if it's the most damning. And at any rate, Donald Trump enters his not guilty plea remotely today. He doesn't appear in person. He waived his right to appear in person today. And that includes, and several of the other 18 defendants who have been charged alongside Trump also waived their appearances at the arraignment. The left is angry today. Politico makes a special point of emphasizing that Donald Trump referred to himself 3 times as President Trump or President Donald Trump in the court filing today. And they hate this. First of all, they hate that Trump was ever president of the United States. And they hate when people say the words President Trump. President Trump. They don't even like saying Trump. Have you noticed the left likes to say things like the former guy? That's what they'll say. Or they'll say TFG for short because they're children. They can't say a name. It's like Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. He who shall not be named. President Donald Trump. They are furious that he referred to himself as President Trump in his legal filing today. And of course, he has every right to do so because, yes, he was president of the United States. But that leads me to what the left and anti-Trump Republicans even are attempting to do when it comes to the ballots in the next election, whether it's in the Republican primary or, more specifically, in the general election, in a situation where Donald Trump is the nominee, as he's expected to be. As of this moment, there is a concerted, well-funded, aggressive effort to remove Donald Trump's name from the ballot in a range of states across the country. They want to deprive the voters of the ability to even have the chance to tick the box next to the name Donald J. Trump. They can't trust voters with this, so they want to take his name off of the ballot entirely. And this week we have some more aggression on this front as we find out that the state of New Hampshire is contemplating whether or not Donald Trump's name can be removed from their ballots. And they're doing this under pressure from an organization called Free Speech for the People, which, of course, is the opposite of what they're trying to do. They don't want free speech for the people. They want constrained speech for the people. The New York Times refers to them as a liberal-leaning group that has sent letters to the Secretaries of State of New Hampshire, as well as Florida, New Mexico, Ohio, Wisconsin. Are you sensing a trend here? They're urging them to bar Mr. Trump from the ballot under the, quote, 14th Amendment. Under the 14th Amendment, they claim they can bar Donald Trump from the ballot. Now, you may have heard some of this already, but I want to make sure people understand what this is about. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was designed to preclude Confederates, people who were actually involved in a real insurrection against the Union, against the United States of America, from holding public office. But there's a number of fascinating details that the media will elide, that will not tell you as they discuss this. And one of them can be found in today's Washington Times. Susan Ferricchio is writing about this today, this effort to remove Trump from the ballot. And in her excellent reporting, she cites our friend Hans von Spakovsky, one of the leading experts on election law in the United States of America. And Hans says in this Washington Times piece that the effort to bar Trump or any other candidate from the ballot is unconstitutional. Unconstitutional. Mr. von Spakovsky said that Congress voted in 1872 and in 1898, this is important, to remove the insurrection disqualification language from the 14th Amendment, as it was permitted to do with a 2/3 vote. You see, what Hans is talking about, and it's important if you're going to stare at the Constitution and then think that you can use it to your advantage here, you may want to read the last sentence of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which says that Congress can change the punishment for, quote, insurrectionists through a 2/3 vote of both houses. Well, it just so happened that occurred twice, in 1872 and 1898. The Congress voted to remove that, quote, punishment from the 14th Amendment. Now, you can sit there, as I do, and say Donald Trump is not an insurrectionist. He was never convicted of such a thing. He wasn't even he wasn't even found guilty of such a thing in the impeachment that took place in early 2021. He was acquitted by the United States Senate. There is no basis to say that he's an insurrectionist. He was the president of the United States, engaged in First Amendment protected activity, fighting to make sure that the election was pure. That's it. That's it. It doesn't matter to what extent he may have been mistaken about fraud in any particular district in the country. It's irrelevant. But even if you could establish that he, quote, was leading an insurrection, even that wouldn't be the basis for removing his name from the ballot. This 14th Amendment argument is horse crap. And Hans von Spakovsky indicates exactly why. 1872, 1898, Congress, using a power that is found directly inside of the 14th Amendment, said, no, we're not doing that anymore. And by the way, why did Congress do that in 1872 and 1898? It was to reunify the country. It was to try and bring the country together. It was a time of national healing in the wake of a very bloody, very deadly civil war that almost ripped this country to pieces. They were trying to figure out a way to unify and heal this country. That's not the interest, by the way, of the modern left. No interest in unifying or healing the country. Hell, they have no interest in the voters. They don't want the voters to render a judgment on any of this. So they're trying to remove Trump from the ballot. And it's happening all over the place. As I said, the secretaries of state of New Hampshire, Florida, New Mexico, Ohio, Wisconsin are all receiving incoming now from left-wing groups who think that they can, and anti-Trump Republicans for that matter, who think they can remove a political candidate from the ballot. In fact, here's a Republican candidate for president right now who will never be president, but his name is Asa Hutchinson. You know him. He was on the debate stage recently. And he said at the debate, and he's been saying on CNN lately, that Donald Trump needs to be removed from the ballot. He's probably not even eligible.
But what I want to point out is I'm not even sure he's qualified to be the next president of the United States. And so you can't be asking us to support somebody that's not perhaps even qualified under our Constitution. And I'm referring to the 14th Amendment that a number of legal scholars said that he is disqualified because of his actions on January 6th.
So here you have a Republican breathing life into a horse crap theory, giving the left a pretext to point to the right and say, look, even Republicans support this. Let's remove this guy. Let's take him off the ballot and let's deprive voters of that candidate. Now, tell me, if you were to pick, if you were to assess this, what would you call it? What would you call it? You would call it election meddling, election interference. You would call it ballot interference. You would call it voter suppression. You would call it depriving people of ballot access. What they're engaging in is a trampling of civil liberties. They want to destroy your ability to actually render a judgment. You stay out of this. We're going to remove Trump from the ballot, and then we'll let you pick from the limited selection we offer you. Talk about an insurrection. They're leading a rebellion against the American people here. That's what this is. That's an actual insurrection. We're witnessing it. So, what is happening with all of this? Well, I should point out that the left has not only been trying to do this to Trump. They have engaged in this tactic for some time now. And if we just roll back to last year, a number of headlines on the very same subject involving a bunch of different people. One, remember Madison Cawthorn, the congressman in the wheelchair from North Carolina? The left claimed that he had given aid and comfort to the, quote, insurrection, and therefore needed to be disqualified from his ballot in North Carolina. Now, Madison Cawthorn would go on to lose his re-election campaign. But ahead of that, the left tried to get his name taken off the ballot entirely to deprive the voters of the ability to even select him. Now, that didn't work because in the end, a judge ruled on the basis of what Hans von Spakovsky told us, that Congress had already nullified that section of the 14th Amendment. Stop screwing around with this. You can't remove him from the ballot. His name stays. And with his name on the ballot, he lost re-election. They also tried to do this to Marjorie Taylor Greene. May of last year, Marjorie Taylor Greene was able to prevail in keeping her name for re-election on the ballot, which, of course, she won re-election, so she prevailed. And a judge ruled in May of last year that she could stay on the ballot. This was Judge Charles Boudreau in a 19-page opinion. He said that the people who tried to remove her name, quote, failed to prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence. He said the evidence in the case was insufficient to establish that Marjorie Taylor Greene, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or gave aid or comfort to the enemies thereof under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Brad Raffensperger reaffirmed that claim as well. But this is the same group, Free Speech for the People, that tried to remove her from the ballot. Free Speech for the People, that's the name of the organization. They deserve some closer scrutiny, don't they? Look at the funding for that group. Here's another one for you. Arizona Supreme Court rejects insurrectionist ballot challenge to Biggs, Gosar, and Fincham. This was May of last year as well. This was during the midterms. The left, see what they were doing was they were doing test runs to see if they could get Trump removed in 2024. That's what this was about. So they were trying to pick off individual members of Congress, and they didn't have success here, thank God, because these judges looked at these cases and said, no, you can't do this. But how much court shopping are they going to be doing to find a judge who will sign on to this? The Arizona Supreme Court, again, this is from azmirror.com. This is last year in May. The Arizona Supreme Court flatly rejected an attempt to disqualify Republican Congressman Andy Biggs and Paul Gosar and State Representative Mark Fincham from the 2022 ballot for their alleged roles in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Now, let me just emphasize something. None of these men had a, quote, alleged role in an attack on the Capitol. Even that is just garbage. The court ruling, the candidates are not disqualified from appearing on the ballot for the 2022 primary election. They agreed with a lower court's determination that the authority to disqualify candidates under the 14th Amendment rests in the hands of Congress and not the courts. Of course, as I mentioned already, yes, the 14th Amendment explicitly lays out that Congress can eliminate the, quote, the punishment for insurrection. And these guys were never found guilty of anything related to an insurrection. It's all a scam. It's a scam designed to deprive voters of options on the ballot. So you're seeing it play out now, yet again. And is it going to happen somewhere? Is it going to happen in one of these states? You're going to get some whack job Secretary of State? All it takes is one. All it takes is one of them. Somebody with say-so over the ballot. Look at what happened in Pennsylvania. They're not even allowed to do the things they did in Pennsylvania during the 2020 election. They were constitutionally and legislatively barred from changing things like, ballot curing to when the ballots can be returned. Oh, you can send them in after Election Day. They were making up the rules in violation of the law. You don't think somebody's going to try and yank Trump's name off the ballot? You have a number of states right now where you have state officials. New Hampshire's contemplating it. Well, we got to take a look at it. We got to see whether or not this can happen. You have a number of states right now where this is actually going on. It's actually happening. In Arizona, the New York Times reports, the Secretary of State says he has heard from concerned citizens about the issue. In Michigan, the Secretary of State said she was, quote, taking it seriously. In Georgia, officials are looking at the precedent set by the failed attempt to use the 14th Amendment to disqualify Marjorie Taylor Greene from the ballot. So in each of these states, and these are important states, Arizona, Michigan, Georgia, these are deeply important states in the presidential election. You have state officials contemplating stealing the election. Can we be more clear about it? Is that as clear as I need to be? They want to steal the election and deprive the voters of the ability to render a judgment in the first place. You're watching it. Let's go to line 6. That's where Philip in Ohio is. Philip, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Good afternoon, Vince. Thanks for taking my call. What you've got here is all a version of what's become known as lawfare. Initially came out of Brookings from a guy named Ben Vitties. And essentially, it is using laws, regulations, the Constitution to tie you up and make you use your resources, your people, your lawyers, your money. And it was most effective in the initial impeachment, where essentially they turned over to the Congress a roadmap to go after Trump. And basically, you're constantly on the defense. And the Republicans haven't figured this out.
Yeah. And they use massive distortions of both the law and the Constitution to trigger this. And I noticed that there's some critics of Trump on the right that are like, oh, he's got to use all of his money for legal defenses. No, wait a second. That is the burden that the left is imposing on him. The reason he has to spend so much of the campaign contributions is because the left is trying to bleed him dry, Philip.
And no one's coming to his defense, Vince. No one.
Yeah. Philip, thank you. Smart points. Really appreciate that. Hold tight. I've got a lot more for you coming up. John Zadrozny is going to be with us from America First Legal moments from now. We're going to talk about how the White House is now saying, we can't see the emails between Hunter and Joe because those are state secrets. Oh, really? Well, good afternoon to you. 3:35 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up today, Chris Bedford is with us. We'll talk about America's very old, very senile politicians and what we can do about that. Stephen Nelson will join us at 5 o'clock. He's a White House correspondent for the New York Post. We'll get into the Hunter Biden non-investigation that the Biden administration is conducting. Stephen with some new details on that subject. And you can chat with us today, as always, at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Speaking of Hunter Biden, the White House has cited executive privilege to withhold hundreds of emails involving Hunter Biden's business dealings. So what interest does the government have in keeping secret a private citizen's business dealings? The White House tells us all the time, we're not allowed to ask questions about Hunter Biden of the White House. Go ask Hunter's people. He's a private citizen, they say. Weird. They're withholding hundreds of emails related to Hunter Biden's business dealings. And then Vice President Joe Biden is on the other end of that, the email. And this is all, these emails were requested by the organization America First Legal. And the deputy director of investigations there is a man called John Zadrozny, and he joins us on the phone now. John, good to have you with us, sir.
Yeah. Hey, Vince, thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
So I thought Hunter Biden was a private citizen. Why would it be a state secret what he and his father are emailing about?
That's a great question, Vince. So to give the audience a little bit of background, over a year ago, we requested a series of documents from different sources regarding Joe Biden's tenure as vice president, including from the National Archives and Records Administration. We primarily did that because it was past the window during which those documents could be withheld from the public, and they were generally, in theory, available. So we put in the request and figured we'd see what happened. Well, it took them a year, But we finally got about 1,000 plus documents, mostly emails, back, which shows some really interesting things. And these are the ones we were able to see.
Yes.
Everything ranging from basically the Office of the Vice President's communication shop being at Hunter's and Rosemont Seneca's disposal for communicating on tough issues, to Hunter being involved in helping to plan events, including a state dinner at Barack Obama's White House in 2011. There's much more there. I encourage people to go check it out. What's interesting, though, is they did withhold 270 documents, probably mostly email, that they have not turned over. Now, not to oversell it, it's worth pointing out that this is something that kind of automatically happens with the National Archives, because they usually have a lot of documents. There's not always the ability to communicate directly with a former president or a current president, and so they put a hold on. They tell the requester that there's a hold on, and in the meantime, they communicate with the president and the former president or the former vice president. Well, in this case, the person is the same person. It's the current president, Joe Biden. And so it's possible some of those will come out. It's possible none of them will come out. It's possible that they'll say, well, we want to claw back some others that we put out or find other records they can't release. The bottom line is it's a misuse of executive privilege in a sense, because, yes, federal law does accord vice presidents certain confidentiality regarding records. They have the ability to disclose to withhold records, rather, that were used to obtain advice from advisors.
Yeah.
Executive privilege is a very basic idea. It's basically designed to give presidents or executives the ability to talk freely with staff, and the staff know that those communications won't be released, because if you know your communications, your very candid communications with the president or vice president are going to be released,
Right.
You might say different things, right? So we understand that. But it is not applicable here, and I can get into that too if you.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that would be applicable between hired government officials and the president of the United States. But for the vice president of the United States, which, by the way, is already a fake job, why would you get executive privilege as vice president? And then talking to your son, who's a private citizen, how could you make any executive privilege claim over any of those communications?
Well, Vince, before I get into that, you raise a really great point, which is that the vice president actually wields zero authority in the federal government. And everyone, I think the average American thinks, oh, the vice president's got a lot of power. The vice president has zero power.
Right.
I mean, God rest John McCain, but he used to say it perfectly. He said the only job of the vice president was to attend foreign funerals and inquire daily about the health of the president. And that's true, because until you're president, you're not president. However, federal law does give vice presidents some confidentiality to protect their records and some extra protections that you and I would not get if we were a different type of federal official. But you're right. With executive privilege, generally, it's important. You don't get to use it if you are not talking to your federal advisors. So there are two reasons why it's probably inaccurate for him to use executive privilege here. One is again, you're talking to your advisors. You're just not talking to family and friends. You can't just invoke executive privilege because you don't want the public to know you said something. It's supposed to be, again, for those situations where you're talking with the people in your inner circle to get the most candid advice to make the best possible decisions. But the other is it also only applies to federal employees, which means unless we're missing something and Hunter's got some sort of secret squirrel federal contract somewhere, it doesn't apply to him or anyone at Rosemont Seneca or anyone else in his private universe.
Yes.
Now, the flip side here, though, the very dangerous flip side to this is these are proper invocations of executive privilege, and it's because he was extensively discussing his son's business dealings and his own business dealings, let's just say it out loud, with official vice presidential staff during his time in the office of the vice president.
In other words, maybe he's revealing, state secrets and telling, like real state secrets, like, hey, I am going to work to get the Ukrainian prosecutor booted, so you can now start using that as a talking point in your conversations with Burisma.
Right. He's in trouble, in my opinion, either way. Either he's inappropriately using executive privilege, in which case some of these documents will out after a court battle, or he's appropriately using them, and it just shows the extent to which it's almost impossible to distinguish his personal business dealings from his official existence as vice president. This is the one disappointing thing I think we've all come to fully appreciate about Joe Biden since he's entered the White House, Vince, which is that there really is nothing that Joe Biden does that isn't about his own personal financial or family financial gain or benefit. And it's really troubling because anyone else who's worked in the federal government has to be exceedingly careful to make sure they're not even appearing to use their office to gain anything.
Yes.
Like you could get in a lot of trouble if you get an extra discount on a car purchase.
No question. Yeah, you can't. You're not allowed to put a family member of yours on a government flight. That's not allowed for any federal official. And you have Hunter Biden now documented something like dozens of times flying on Air Force Two to places that he has business interests in that enrich his family. So it's nonstop what we're witnessing here. Also, with regards to the emails, The public record already includes some evidence, and this may be the product of your work at America First Legal, some evidence that the Biden press shop at the time, the vice president's aides and press people, were kind of on a routine basis having to work to try and make Hunter Biden-related scandals go away because the appearance of impropriety was so great that you did have corporate news outlets reaching out to the Biden team and saying, hey, what's the deal with Hunter Biden becoming a board member at Burisma at this really important time in Ukrainian affairs?
Yeah, you're correct. It's actually, we did lodge, I just lodged some of those records with an earlier FOIA request, and we were able to get those earlier this year. And yes, it showed exactly that. It showed that the Office of the Vice President's press shop was essentially running point for Hunter in terms of pushing back on any claims that there was any inappropriate conduct through Burisma. And that just raises a ton of questions, like basically any circumstance where a media outlet reached out to the Office of Vice President knowing full well that they were really reaching out to Hunter's media outlet. That's at taxpayer expense. How is that appropriate? How were those employees doing their jobs? Were they not doing other things that they were supposed to do in the course of their jobs to make sure that Hunter's scandals went away?
Yes.
And so on. But it's a total mess. And yes, that is something that, keep in mind, that came out much earlier and even predated Devin Archer's testimony before the House, where things were really interesting.
And I know in those emails you have Hunter himself responding to the requests, telling the vice president's staff members how to respond to it, what to say. Here are the details you should include. That's all in there.
Yeah, and that shows that he knew, probably with the nod of his father to staff at the time, that he had full control. Essentially, think of it this way. This is how I think of it. Vice President Joe Biden during the Obama administration was lending the weight, power, and federal taxpayers of the Office of the Vice President to help Hunter's business operations and protect him from scandal. There's really no other way to say it. And that's illegal.
Yes.
There's just no other way to do it. It also, by the way, reminds us all, to the extent that anyone wants to pretend that Joe Biden had no idea any of this was going on, not only did he know it was going on, not only was he aware of specifics, but he was probably involved in it at every step of the way, including using the federal taxpayer-subsidized office he held to make sure his son's business dealings were accomplished.
John Zadrozny, when you hear people like Karine Jean-Pierre say that that's not a question for the White House, you should ask Hunter Biden, what do you make of that response that the White House has routinely given throughout the administration?
I have a little bit of sympathy for her, but not much once I remember her worldview, which is destructive. The reality is she is in a position where she has to basically lie for the administration every day, and it may be wearing on even her. But what I find really interesting is they've taken a very Orwellian approach to dealing with the issue, Vince, which is that they say something. They'll say the state of reality is X. And then 3 days later, when that's been blown out of the water by FOIA requests and other information and testimony on the Hill, they'll say, well, no, we never said that. We said why. We've been saying why all along. And so for how long, Vince, were they saying there was never, ever, ever, ever any discussion between President Biden and his son about his business dealings? Well, then it turns out that was completely false. And then it turns out, then their new line was, well, he never helped him with any of his business dealings. Well, then that turned out to be false, and this just only further enhances how that's false. Then their new line was, well, no, they were never in business together. I mean, Joe Biden's name was never on corporate paperwork with Hunter. I'm waiting for that shoe to drop, right? What's the story tomorrow?
Yeah, well, here's another story that's been popping up lately, and I want to get your impression of this. The Southeastern Legal Foundation was able to dig up in its own battle with the government evidence that Joe Biden has sent or been involved in at least 5,400 documents of a variety of kinds, emails, electronic records, documents that show him using pseudonyms during his time as vice president of the United States. And I've already seen some excuse-making coming from the left for this, which is, public officials will use dummy email accounts because they're so overwhelmed at their official accounts that they try and use pseudonyms. That doesn't explain why Joe Biden was using 2 Gmail accounts to conduct this business. That wouldn't be an explanation for that. What would be?
No, Vince, actually, first of all, that claim, attempt to run defense for Joe Biden is false because that's actually illegal. Now, there are some loopholes in federal law, and I say loopholes in quotes, that let you use your personal communications for official federal business, only when you can't use your official communications. So that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is you have a man who is corrupt, who didn't want people to know he was corrupt, knew he couldn't use, even with a the lapdog media, he knew even he couldn't use official correspondence to engage in illegal conduct. So he created false email accounts, private email accounts with pseudonyms. And, there are a few reasons why people might use fake email accounts. But the main one, let's just be honest, is you're doing something wrong and you don't want people to see it.
Yes.
And I'd be curious to see when we get to the bottom of what's in those, to the extent we find any of those emails that can be attributed to those email accounts, were they for different things? Like, was one pseudonym for dealing with the Chinese? Was one pseudonym for dealing with the Ukrainians, and so on? I can't wait.
Yes.
Vince, somewhere, I don't know where he is, but Warren G. Harding is breathing a sigh of relief. He is no longer the most corrupt U.S. president of all time.
Also, it's just that email thing is so weird. I mean, look, the archives apparently has some of these documents, so it is interesting that they ended up with access to the documents from the Gmail accounts. Somebody along the way realized that, wait a second, we should probably hand some of this stuff over to the archives. But again, this is the vice president of the United States conducting business on servers controlled by a big tech corporation, Google. Like, none of this adds up except to tell a picture of to tell a story of corruption.
Yeah, no, I agree, Vince. And this all jumps to a whole new level when you realize that corrupt man is no longer vice president, but actually president, right? Because yes, it was inappropriate, and Lord knows that Joe Biden was likely using the power of his office, the weight of his office, to make money since the day he stepped into the U.S. Senate in the 1970s. But once you become president, well, bad things start to happen for a couple of reasons. One of which is you're probably still trying to make money, and you're probably using that office to make even more money, and that's what we haven't found out yet. What is he doing now to keep the pressure on for these illegal business practices? But more importantly, as we've already kind of seen, what happens when a foreign power wants something and you say no? All those records start spilling out into the public domain: audio clips, emails, communications, proof of meetings. And then it makes you wonder. This is why we don't like corrupt officials, because if someone is on the take, we may not like the decisions of certain politicians,
yes,
but if we can say that they're not corrupt, at least those decisions are based on their own decision making and not. Yeah.
Let me. I'm sorry, because you said something super provocative. I want to make sure I understand it. You said this was something we've already seen, that if they don't play ball, then basically the bodies start dropping. The evidence of your guilt starts becoming public. Are you saying? It sounds like you're saying that whenever Joe Biden hasn't provided Ukraine with what it wants, all of a sudden, all of the details from Ukraine start spilling out into public on how Joe Biden enriched his family.
I mean, I think that's already started to happen. I believe there were some audio recordings that showed that Joe was in communications with foreign leadership about certain business practices.
Yes.
I've heard rumors there are more to come. And this is exactly why you don't have corrupt officials, especially presidents, who are on the take from foreign governments, because I've heard, for example, that there might be a battle over Ukraine funding right now. And what if President Biden says no? So we've given you a lot of money. Well, it wouldn't surprise me in the next few days after that conversation happens if more information comes out about this.
Well,
this is why you can't have corrupt leaders.
And as you're explaining this, one of the other things I'm connecting here as I'm thinking about it is, remember the number of times that Biden refused to give some category of weaponry to Ukraine and made the claim in public that would lead to World War III, and then he would eventually relent. He would do it over time. He would say, actually, no, you can have tanks now. Actually, no, you can have the F-16s you want now. And that kept happening over and over and over. You think that those things may be connected here, John?
I think it's very likely. And who knows if that's limited to Ukraine, Vince? For example, who knows if what we're dealing with is, what if there are communications with the Mexican government, and that's why we're seeing some of the issues we're seeing at the border. And again, with China, who knows if some of the things we're seeing regarding China's misfeasance on the global stage has anything to do with Joe being on the take. I mean, this is why we can't. It's worth repeating. This is why we cannot have corrupt leaders, because you may not like their decisions, but at least you know they were based on their own judgment. But what happens if they're not based on their own judgment? What happens if they're based on pressure from foreign powers? We are essentially no longer run by an American anymore. We're run by foreign interests, and that's a big problem.
The critical questions in a critical conversation. John Zadrozny, thank you for digging in, and really appreciate your time today, sir. The Biden administration's efforts to destroy American citizens continuing today. I've got a story out of a courtroom as a federal judge sentences a Proud Boys organizer and says he committed an act of terrorism by shaking a metal fence. Shaking a metal fence. They're saying he's a terrorist because of that. We've got details on that. Also, Chris Bedford is going to join us on our very old politicians.